Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The first standard Lloyd's form of salvage agreement was approved and published by the Committee of Lloyd's, as it was then called, in 1908. It had as its basis that centuries-old principle of no cure, no pay. If a salvor was not successful in salvaging the ship and or its cargo, then the salvor got no reward. On the other hand, if a salvor was successful, then he received a fair and encouraging reward. Lloyd's form today, 107 years later, still carries those words, no cure, no pay, and the salvor's efforts in saving property are still rewarded in a similar manner, although the criteria is now encapsulated in the Salvage Convention, Article 13. Lloyd's form has been amended 11 times in those 107 years, moving ahead of existing law on many occasions. In 1980, in response to growing environmental concerns, perhaps the most radical change to Lloyd's form took place when the principle of no cure, no pay was for the first time tempered by providing a mechanism to reward salvors, or rather allowing salvors to recover their expenses in rendering services to a laden or partly laden tanker, although their efforts to salve the vessel may be thwarted or were not successful. The concept of there being to encourage salvors to come to the aid of tankers that pose a threat to the environment. That clause was given the name of the safety net, and the safety net was the precursor to Article 14 of the 1989 Salvage Convention, which extended that concept to any damage threatened or perceived to the environment attributable by the salved property, not just laden or partly laden tankers, but any ship, cargo, bunkers, stores, etc. However, that new convention was unlikely to become law for some time. Lloyd's recognised this fact and so decided to act in advance of legislation and amend Lloyd's form to include Article 13. The revised form, LOF 1990, was published in September 1990, although the convention itself did not come into force until 1995. Unfortunately, as many of you may know, experience was to highlight the difficulties in the interpretation and application of Article 14. And while all sides of marine impunity agreed with the overall concepts, these difficulties meant that the convention was defeating its very purpose, namely to encourage salvors to proceed to the assistance of vessels which threatened damage to the environment. To correct this situation, parties, the International Salvage Union, the International P&I clubs, the ship owners and property insurers got together to develop a new concept, the Special Compensation P&I Clause, or Scopic Clause, which was designed to replace Article 14. When Lloyd's form was revised in 2000, it made specific provision for the parties, should they so wish, to incorporate Scopic, thereby taking out the need to revert to Article 14. It has been widely acknowledged that Scopic has proved to be successful, and one of the cornerstones of that success is the system of the Special Casualty Representative, the SCR, who attends the casualties. As Mike has mentioned, we have the pleasure today of Captain Nick Sloane being here, and Nick is now going to talk through two LOF Scopic cases. Nick.
Thank you, Kevin and Mike. And good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure and honour to be asked to join you today. Why Scopic, and obviously the safety net that Kevin mentioned. I'm just going to go over the role of the casualty representative. So as Kevin mentioned, when you have a Lloyd's open form with no cure, no pay, you also have the option to include the Scopic clause. When you assess a situation, you can then actually invoke it. So it means that you don't actually have to have it invoked until you've made up your mind whether you want to invoke it. But if you haven't incorporated it, you've actually lost that option. So the role of the special casualty representative only becomes effective once solvors have actually invoked Scopic, and then you move on to the Scopic situation. The primary duty shall be the same as a salvage contractor, without the responsibility and liabilities of the salvage masters, but you still are required to use your best endeavours, and that is to represent all your expertise and the network to assist the salvage contractor to recover the maximum value in the salvage operation. So you're representing all parties, and that's all solved interests. You also have to be impartial. So that means you are appointed by owners, P&I liability underwriters, but actually you are not representing the P&I club. So you're there to actually look at the situation and actually look and see what's fair and reasonable to assist the salvage contractor in being successful. When you demonstrate that impartiality, one of the things you have to do is try and build up trust with the local authorities, the coastal states, environmental bodies, and that is to build up the trust so that you can actually explain the difficulties of the operation. Sometimes when they look at a case outside of their comfort zone, some of these authorities have not dealt with a casualty in their career, and then it ends up on their doorstep and they're not really happy about it. So they know that there's going to be an apportion of blame, maybe in the case of the Prestige, where actually a whole government can fall based on the actions of the authorities. So it's very important that you build up that trust immediately, explain the situation, compare it with other cases that have been similar situations around the world, and then sort of be a buffer with the salvage master, with those authorities in monitoring and progressing the operation. So the salvage master, as we mentioned, remains at all times in charge, and he will make the decisions based on what he thinks. You've got to consult with the salvage master. You're allowed to tell him what you think, question his decisions. At the end of the day, you want to build a relationship with the salvage master, so you are there actually to support the operation, and with that, that means the salvage master and his team. Hopefully that's the case. I mean, most situations where it's been incorporated and invoked, the SCR and salvage masters actually have quite a good relationship. Obviously, all personalities are not the same, so there are cases where there are clashes, but at the end of the day, the salvage master is in charge. You are there to represent all the other parties, and if you do have a situation where you cannot agree, then you're required to issue a dissenting letter. That also requires that sometimes a salvage operation might have been underway for about a month before they actually invoke the Scopic clause. So for that month, there's been no cure, no pay. The salvage contractor then loses the benefits of that guaranteed revenue stream, especially if they don't have any success, or let's say the Article 13 is not more sufficient than the Scopic claim to actually cover their costs. So once they've invoked the Scopic clause, you're actually meant to go and do a review of the personnel, mobilisation of equipment and craft. So if you have 100 people on board and there's no cure, no pay, it doesn't matter, because you're going to get paid out of the Article 13 award, and that will be judged by arbitration. If you invoke Scopic, then you have a set fee which has been agreed, and there's an annual or a review every few years on the actual rates, and then it has to be reasonable. You can't have 100 people when 8 or 12 will do. So you have to come to that point where you say, well, this is unreasonable and we're not going to pay for it. There have been situations in China where they've had over 100 people, where you think that once they invoke the Scopic clause, you say, well, actually that's not fair, but we'll pay you for 40. So even though you're going to keep the other 100 there because you can't send them back to the office, you're only paying for 40, and sometimes that works out and they all agree to it. So the salvage master issues a daily report. The SCR is meant to endorse that report once the Scopic's been invoked, and you can actually have any comments. Hopefully those comments are just fair and reasonable without having to resort to the dissenting report. You're also required to distribute that, so obviously it will come through the Lloyd's agency, but if you have any other surveyors who have been appointed, the special representatives, hull and machinery or cargo interests, then you also liaise with those parties and make sure that they get all the documentation that they can, which is fair and reasonable without impacting on the actual operation. They can also have access to the vessel if it's safe and reasonable to do so. So here's a case where, why would you invoke Scopic? Well, if someone says to you, no cure, no pay, you might actually think twice before you throw all your resources at it. But if you invoke Scopic when you have this sort of situation, well then the SCR is appointed, the liability underwriters know that they are in for a possible claim that might exceed, there might not be an Article 13. So this is a situation off the Cape, 17 metre swells, 85 knots of wind. The vessel carrying a lot of fertilizers ended up in a situation on a Friday afternoon where they couldn't get hold of their owners in Singapore to tell them about the situation. They got hold of the office, but no one called them back. They ended up on the beach in an environmentally sensitive area, which is actually also home to 3 environmental impact action groups. So it wasn't very good to have these fertilizers on the beach. In fact, there was a threat that they would actually shoot the salvors if they put anything over the side. So there was different types of fertilizer. Some was relatively benign if you had enough dissolution. There was a lot of energy in the sea waves. So we decided that rather than just liaise with the authorities there, we'd actually bring the community into it as well. And we'd explain to them exactly what the salvage plan was, what the risks were, and the potassium nitrates and all the other fungicides we'd actually keep on board. But if we didn't get this vessel off, then she was going to end up breaking up and they'd have no choice in what ended up on their beach because everything would end up on the beach. So that tried to diffuse the situation, but it's again transparent, open communication. You have to build up that trust. As you can see, there was a lot of energy, so when you're putting the relatively benign fertilizers over the side, then they were happy that that would not cause a major problem. She was successfully refloated and the real nasty stuff was taken off. But again, if you didn't have that safety net, or let's say the ability for the salvors to invoke Scopic, that ship would not have been there. Or let's say the result would not have been there. And there certainly wasn't an Article 13 in this case, so the Scopic clause bear in. The next one was the Coda Cadeau. She had a problem. She hit a rock, managed to beach herself off Hong Kong. Again, fully laden. Started to sink into the soft mud. In Hong Kong, you have the option of these midstream cargo lightering operations, which was a major contribution to the success. So the moment that the salvors saw the first picture, they invoked Scopic, the SCR was appointed, and they said, listen, we don't have much time, we have to get cargo off the deck and reduce the deck loads as quickly as possible. So this was within the first 24 hours, you had access to this fantastic resource. They managed to clean the upper decks. The aft deck, of course, was the least of the problem. But she was going down all the time. The bow was sinking into the soft mud. It made the wetted cargo more difficult. And as people know, containers are not designed to take fully wetted containers out. So you had a lot of breakage. So that required oil pollution booms to be deployed, not just for the oil pollution, but any other residues from the containers. Your working space is cramped. Even though we try and comply with IMCO when we train our people, you're not going to comply with some of the guidelines when you're actually carrying out salvage. But again, you can see a remarkable achievement of the amount of cargo they managed to clear. This is just the indication that she actually sunk 11 meters into the mud. So the bow was actually 18 meters underwater. She had a negative trim of about 36 meters. Then we had a typhoon that was impacting on the area, which added a few other problems. What it did do was it increased the energy in the waves a lot. That both affected the stability, but it also increased the movement of the bow in the mud. And it was relatively soft mud, so she actually started rolling over with a loss of stability. Then we had the hatch covers. Some of the cargo had now had enough of being subjected to 10 meters underwater. They decided it was time to come up to the surface. These hatch covers had been dogged down, but when you got cargo that's decided to float, the forces were quite incredible. You've got high-speed ferries that go between Hong Kong and Macau and onto the mainland China, and this was just outside of the high-speed ferry zone. But obviously all drifting cargo and containers have to be tried and identified and kept away from those ferries. This was a situation for the refloat. So you can see that she's all underwater. So the idea was to take out the hatch covers on the forward hatch or the forward hold. You'd reinforce the hatch cover, build a trunking, then re-establish the hatch cover, and we'd actually pump it out through the snorkels that went through the surface. For that, you've got to make sure that the hatch covers can take the pressure above the hatch cover when you start having a bubble of air underneath the hatch cover. We couldn't use compressed air because at that depth, most of the hull and bulkheads would collapse with 2 bar overpressure to get down there. So pumping it out through the snorkel was deemed the right way. And this was a modified hatch cover. Again, you choose your shipyards, the suitable shipyard. You have to make sure that whatever they do in the fabrication is to your satisfaction and braced enough to support the forces. It's not your average fabrication facility, but they have to be flexible. So here it is back in situation. Start pumping through the top. The forecast was perfect, and then it changed quickly. So this was actually all within a couple of hours. Now the worst thing is that as the hatch covers come towards the surface, with the squall that's going through, you get more energy in the waves, and you could actually break the seal on the hatch cover when she's still a meter underwater. Then you lose that seal and she goes back down. So we had that sort of risk. We had to get through that bad weather. This was even another 4 or 5 hours later when she was relatively secure. And again, what could have been a total loss and a major difficult wreck removal situation in her location became a sort of relatively benign operation. She had some repairs done, obviously very good ship facilities in China, and she was back in service about 4 months later. Again, the salvors would never have been there without that Scopic. So without the response, you're going to have a major distribution of those containers when they float off. Salvors are your best form of response once the crew lose control of the situation. So the crew are the best response before that, but once you lose response, then you need to have a salvage contractor that you can call on to come and support you. And obviously with the Scopic clause, and you have the ability to entice him to come when there's not much chance of an Article 13 award on the no cure, no pay. So the role of the SCR is then to look at these different salvage method statements produced by the salvage master, try and convince the authorities that even though they've never seen this method, that actually it should work, and hopefully the coastal state can get rid of their problem as soon as possible as well. So that's just the overview from the Lloyd's open form, the invoke of Scopic. And then at the end of it, the SCR has to make a final report, and that will go to substantiate the spreadsheets that are generated by the contractor and to help close out the case on behalf of the P&I. When they do invoke Scopic, if they are successful in getting an Article 13 award, then there is a penalty clause that they get. So the difference between the guaranteed rate they get under the Scopic clause and an award under Article 13, they would lose 25% of that possible bonus as a penalty for invoking Scopic. But the Code of Cadeau was such a case. There was an Article 13 award that exceeded Scopic, but without knowing how successful you'd be, you'd rather take the risk of that 25% penalty than to not have the Scopic clause available for you. So it works, it's been highly successful. There are cases where it might not be strictly necessary to invoke it, but from my experience in most of the salvage, working on both sides of the, as a contractor and a SCR, it's a fantastic safety net and very useful and quick to invoke and incorporate. Thank you. For the salvage contractor. Yeah, so if you have a Lloyd's Open form and you've incorporated the Scopic clause, you don't have to invoke it until you really need to. So there might be let's say a case where there's a ship on fire, a tanker. The good thing about tankers is that you can put out the fire and the oil should help it float. So then you might not invoke the Scopic clause. You carry on, then there's some major structural failure, and you actually know that you're not going to be making an Article 13 award, which is the award based at arbitration based on the recovered values, and that's all the values: ship, hull, cargo, bunkers. So at that point you invoke Scopic. That means that all of your efforts up until that point of time do not count for Scopic. So if you've had a month where you've been working round the clock and you're hoping to refloat the ship completely successfully and it breaks, then all of those efforts are for nothing. So you've taken a lot of risk, but you have the balance to now respond to the oil pollution and to actually minimize the impact for the liability or all the other parties, to invoke Scopic and continue on a day rate. But that day rate only starts the day or the time that you invoke Scopic. So that's a set day rate, it's a spreadsheet, it's not that too difficult to monitor. You know, the only thing is the equipment that's mobilized fair and reasonable for that situation. That can depend on the location. So if you're in the middle of the South Atlantic, Tristan da Cunha, you mobilize a lot more than you might expect to need because you're not sure what's available there. If it's just off the coast of Italy or the UK, you have a lot of contractors that can respond within a day or two to actually top up your equipment. So you wouldn't have to mobilize initially as much as at the end. Yeah, basically there, once you broke up, you were hoping you could save the bow. When the fire started in the bow, then any chance of property value recovered was diminishing, and once you went down, well then you were just on a Scopic fee. That's if you invoke the Scopic clause. So you need to have a good relationship between the commercial manager and the salvage master. And if you can look at a photograph, sometimes it doesn't take any rocket science to say, well, this is a Scopic case. But on other situations, there might be some debate. We had a case called the Iran Ardabil in Yemen in 2004. And we were talking about invoking Scopic, but they weren't keen on us invoking Scopic. Well, she was a maiden voyage, brand new ship, fully laden, but the bow was 60 meters from the water. So she actually hit the rock at full speed, and there was a chance that she would actually break. So there was a long debate about who's going to invoke the Scopic clause? Are we going to invoke the Scopic clause? So in the end we said, well, we'll take the first phase of the response on risk and then hopefully get the cargo lightened before she does break. So there, the Scopic was not invoked, and you went back to the Article 13 award.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick.